All right, so we're continuing to go through the book of Jeremiah, and we started out learning who Jeremiah is. Then we went into a little bit about some of the warnings that Jeremiah has for the people of Judah. And then we actually took a little bit of a leap forward and we started talking about authorities, civic authorities and religious authorities. So this week we're going to go back.
Marty, you've got to come back with me.
And when I say go back, we're just going to go back to the last section that we kind of skipped over. And in this section, I think you see something fascinating that maybe differs a little bit from how a lot of people look at the God of the Old Testament. A lot of people will look at the God of the Old Testament and say, this God is angry, this God is vengeful. But in reality, what you end up seeing is a God that is actually sorrowful. It's a God who mourns the fact that he feels like this spouse, so to speak, has been unfaithful to him. And as a result of that, he's looking at it as a God who is fully good, fully just, fully righteous, and saying, what right does an unfaithful spouse have to the head of the household? This is very much the analogy that you'll end up seeing here in chapter 11. And I just think that's such an interesting way to look at it. Instead of it being God who is looking at these petulant, rebellious individuals and saying, you're disobeying me, you're doing a bad thing, and almost looking like a dictator saying, because you've been disobedient, I'm going to punish you. Instead, you have a God who is heartbroken at the fact that he established this covenant and said, I want to be your God and I want you to be my people so that I can bless you, so I can give you peace and prosperity. I can give you this promised land. And yet these people couldn't remain faithful to that God that promised them everything. And it is heartbreaking when you think about it. That's exactly what you end up seeing in the heart of God being revealed through these prophecies. Now, as you sit here and you skip through a little bit, you end up seeing some other interesting things that start kind of developing a little bit what is causing these people of Judah to be rebellious. And I think this is where some of this study of Jeremiah, once again, has a connection to how we feel today. Because what you end up seeing is that one of those chief things that has caused his people to go away from him is pride. It's this idea of these individuals who are proud in who they are, or proud of their birthright, or they feel a sense of entitlement. And because of this pride, it is causing them to look to aspects of their own work or aspects of their own society for contentment and for peace. How many Christians do that today? I mean, how many Christians will sit here and they'll say things like, oh, I want to give my life to Christ. I want to live for nothing but God. But then yet, when you look at what actually sustains them, when you look at what they actually cling to for peace and security, they end up looking at things that they've done, or they end up looking at jobs that they feel like they have earned, or they end up looking at maybe an aspect of society that they have contributed to. People love looking at things of men and then saying, oh, well, I'll cling to that. Because in our minds, we fool ourselves into thinking I understand that and therefore I trust it more. Not even accounting for the fact that everything that mankind touches has flaws built into it. It's only our faith in Christ that is going to remain faithful. That is the only firm foundation that's going to ultimately be able to carry us through whatever this life has to throw at us. Now, one of the other things that we saw just a few verses prior in chapter 13 was something that really starts getting to the purpose of us, at least in terms of our role being individuals that are a part of God's creation and God's children. God is pretty clear that what he wants out of his people, this whole I will be your God and you will be my people, is he wants a creation that is going to be devoted to his fame, his praise, and his glory. Those are the three things that we end up seeing God communicating through the prophet Jeremiah. And, I think this is one of those areas where oftentimes I like to stop and address the fact that some people hear that and they say, well, that sounds quite arrogant of God. Why would God just sit here and say that, he wants us to be all about his fame and his praise and his glory? It sounds so conceited. But I want you to just stop and consider this for 1 second. If God is who we say he is, who else would he glorify? Whose fame would he prioritize over his own? If God is the creator of all things, if he is all goodness, if he is all purpose, if he is all powerful, then orienting ourselves towards His fame, His praise, and His glory is exactly what we should be doing. And it's exactly what God should be encouraging us to do. Because ultimately, if those are the things that we are valuing, or the things of God, well, those are the things that are going to be that firm foundation for whatever life throws at us. So it is important for us to serve that purpose. Now, if that is our purpose, then I want you to consider this. How do you think God deals with individuals who, I don't know, maybe distract His people from that purpose? He probably deals with them pretty severely. You know, we did an entire series where we looked at how people talk about God in social media terms and some of those influences that oftentimes bombard us due to algorithms and whatnot on the internet. Well, one of the reasons why I went into that is because I think sometimes people will tend to look at individuals who are trying to teach or preach about the gospel or preach about the Bible, and they'll say, you know, I mean, what's the harm? So what? So they're not getting everything right. At least they're trying. But what you end up seeing here in Jeremiah is where that can actually be a problem. Like, even if you have good intentions, if your effect is something that, you know, is so wrapped up in like what you want to do, that you want to be a preacher, that you want to tell everybody about God, and you're not stopping to consider what is God calling you to do, it can lead to these situations where maybe we're communicating things that aren't consistent with the Bible. Maybe we're living our lives in a way that don't reflect the same gospel that we're preaching, and that's going to end up burdening somebody else's heart. What we see in the very next chapter in Jeremiah is how God talks about these individuals, these priests, these prophets that God did not send, but yet they're going and they are preaching anyway. They want that status. They want that social justification, that they're somehow righteous and a good person. So they're doing things that look a lot like they're teaching and preaching, but yet God is looking at it, and He goes as far as to look at Jeremiah and say, Jeremiah, don't even pray for these individuals, because they went even though I did not send them. And this is once again one of these areas that I think is a pretty strong warning for a lot of individuals who maybe want to get ahead of their skis a little bit. Maybe they're passionate about their faith, but in doing that, they start focusing more on what they think they want to do to feel holy rather than what God is calling them to do. Now, ladies and gentlemen, it has finally happened. We've been going through Jeremiah, and we finally hit that most said of said phrases from Jeremiah. Jeremiah 17:9, for the heart is deceitful above all things and incurable. Who can understand it? The very next section that at least I started really zoning in on was when you start looking at chapter 17, you know, so we've gone through and we said we exist for the purpose of promoting God's fame and His praise and His glory. And then you look at individuals who would interfere with that. And God has all kinds of harsh things to say about these individuals that are tearing His people away from their ultimate purpose. But then there's a warning for all of us that we can't just look at the religious leaders and say, well, it's their fault that I was distracted. It's their fault that they didn't teach me the right thing. What you see is an appeal to discernment for us to remember that sometimes our hearts want things that are inconsistent with what God is calling us to do. Sometimes our hearts want things that are fleshly. Sometimes our hearts want things that boost up our own ego, our own pride. Sometimes we want things because we have a short-term perspective and we want that temporary payoff, that little pleasure, that little dopamine hit. But in reality, God has something that is bigger and better for us. In the following verses, you end up looking and seeing God communicating through Jeremiah the trappings of what happens when we rely on our own understanding and exactly how dangerous that can be. As we close out this section of Jeremiah, we end up seeing a lamentation, and it's the result of the fact that Jeremiah has spoken this truth in the midst of a generation that is falling away from God and pursuing their own vices, is pursuing things that edify their own pride. And so these individuals naturally hear someone like Jeremiah who is preaching truth, and that is unacceptable. So they grab him and they arrest him. At the moment that he is released, you see him lamenting the fact that all this is happening, that God's children are rebelling against God. And Jeremiah, knowing and hearing what the penalty is, is mournful over the fact that these people who had everything, they had every blessing that God could possibly offer, still decided that their way was better, that they trusted more in the mechanizations of mankind than they did in their Creator. But what's interesting is this, and it's one of those big takeaways, I think, once again, is something that's important for us to remember. It's that Jeremiah looks in chapter 20, verse 11, and he says, "But my God is like a violent warrior." He remembers the fact that God is with him, that even in the midst of his sorrow and his trials and pain and everything else he may be dealing with, that his God reigns supreme, that his God has dominion. That is one of those messages that I think is important for us, especially when we look at the world around us and it's full of so many uncertainties, whether it's cultural uncertainties, whether it's violence, whether it's politics, like whatever it may be. There's so many things for us to be worried about, even in our own personal lives, relationships, finances, situations that we're having with our households and our kids, maybe disagreements we're having with other people that are inside the community or our church family, regardless of what it may be. There's so many reasons for us to be depressed and have anxiety. And it's important for us to remember in those moments that underpinning everything is a God that has dominion over our victories and over our trials, that is there in our victories and is just as good and righteous in our defeats. Because that and the hope that we have in our faith in this God is the thing that carries us through. So that no matter what happens to us in this life, whether that be a good thing or a bad thing, we keep our eyes centered on the cross. We understand that in our victories, we should remain humble and not succumb to our pride, because God reigns supreme. And that in our defeats and in our trials and in our suffering, we should remember that we can take hope, because our God is compassionate. And he also reigns just as supreme and is just as good at our low points as he was during our high points. That's our lesson that I have for today. I hope you're able to get something out of it, and so we can meet again. God bless.